Your trailer causes you, when you are writing it and then voicing it, to distill down the point of your show. So you are giving people the base reason for why they should listen to this, who it's made for, and what they're ultimately going to get out of it. And then more granularly, when is the show coming out? How many episodes is it? Who are the hosts? All of these are things that you must be able to articulate clearly so that somebody who comes across your cover art and then reads the name of your show and then listens to the first 30 seconds of your trailer and then decides to continue listening to the trailer. There's a lot of drop-off points here, but hopefully you are keeping them engaged. And even if you're not, you're weeding out the people that the show is not made for.
Hey everyone, welcome back to The Podcast Life. Today I am joined by Arielle Nissenblatt, and we are talking all about podcast trailers. I've kind of been on a pre-production kick lately, so this fits in perfectly. But Arielle, you've done so many things in the podcast industry. What's the latest? What are you doing now? And can you just tell the listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yes, I would love to. Thank you for having me. I have done a lot of random things in the podcast industry. I started a newsletter in 2017, so almost 8 years ago, that I still run, podcast recommendation newsletter, that I speak with podcast curators around the world who want to bring me and all of the subscribers their 5 favorite podcasts. And what's great about that newsletter is that it allows me to know what's the latest and greatest, what trends are emerging with podcasts and with stories around the world. That newsletter led me to go to Podcast Movement, which is a great podcast conference in 2017. And that conference led me to the idea to pitch a co-working studio, that they should have a podcast studio in Los Angeles in 2018. So I managed a studio for like a year and a half. And then that led me to working at Castbox, which is a podcast listening app. I did that for a year. And then I moved to Squadcast, the remote recording platform from there. I was there for 3 years. And then I worked at Descript when Descript bought Squadcast in 2023. And I recently left Descript. So now I'm doing a lot of interesting freelance things that I can get into shortly. But all while I was doing all of the things I just mentioned, I've always kept up with podcast marketing and what's it going to take to grow your show and what causes a potential listener to become a loyal listener. I'm always thinking about these things, always asking these questions, and always trying to share helpful advice with people, because there's a lot of BS on the internet that I've tried to debunk.
Yeah, I have seen that a lot. And I'm just like always texting with Jesse Cannon, a producer I work with on I've lost track of how many shows now, but I'm always just like, some of this seems correct, some of this not so correct.
Made up.
Yeah. And obviously a lot of stuff depends on what your goals are for your podcast, how you're going to market it, what you're trying to get out of it, how you're going to monetize it. But one thing I always recommend that everyone does with a podcast is make a podcast trailer. And I know you are a big fan of podcast trailers.
I love trailers. I do.
You may or may not have a whole podcast about podcast trailers.
That's the truth. Yeah. I think they're great. I liked them initially just as a consumer because there's so much out there. How do you figure out what's worth your time? The trailer is at least trying to give you a quick sense of, is this podcast for you?
Yeah. I will tell clients to, just do 1 to 2 minutes. It doesn't need to be super long. Some people will do some longer things, especially if it's more narrative stuff, and they'll do 6 to 10 minute trailers or something, just so you really get a feel for personalities and what to expect. And the first thing I wanted to really talk about is a podcast trailer from a marketing perspective, because there are technical reasons why you want a podcast trailer on the back end, and we'll go into that later in the episode. But I really want to hone in on the marketing first, because I feel like marketing is where I'm hearing most podcasters are struggling. They're like, we're having trouble marketing and getting growth, and that is something that has been very, very common lately.
Huge.
So what do you think it is about a podcast trailer that just helps a lot from a marketing perspective?
There are a few key components of a trailer that lend themselves really well to marketing. So the first is that your trailer causes you, when you are writing it and then voicing it, to distill down the point of your show. So you are giving people the base reason for why they should listen to this, who it's made for, and what they're ultimately going to get out of it. And then more granularly, when is the show coming out? How many episodes is it? Who are the hosts? All of these are things that you must be able to articulate clearly so that somebody who comes across your cover art and then reads the name of your show and then listens to the first 30 seconds of your trailer and then decides to continue listening to the trailer. There's a lot of drop-off points here, but hopefully you are keeping them engaged. And even if you're not, you're weeding out the people that the show is not made for. So your trailer allows you to figure out for yourself and for your listeners why you're making the show and who's the show for. Also, your trailer allows you to populate your RSS feed before you're necessarily ready to drop your first episode. There are a lot of shows that launch and then they are like 6 weeks is over and then their limited run series is done, 6 weeks. But if you drop a trailer 2 weeks before that, you have a 2-week runway to start sending people to your podcast on Apple Podcasts or your website or Spotify or wherever it is that you're sending people to listen. And that allows people to hit the subscribe button, hit the follow button, start leaving you ratings and reviews. And ultimately, you can use that as social proof to get people excited about the show. It also allows you to promote that trailer on other shows. So now you've got this hopefully highly produced piece of short audio that tells everybody about your show. And now you can say to a bunch of other shows, that have similar topics, themes to you, you can say, I have a show dropping about the volcanic eruption of 1723. I never know where my brain is going to go when I give examples. And that one was crazy. I have a show coming out about this really historic volcanic event. And you have a show about really historic earthquakes. And I think that we would be really great partners to collaborate because my listeners are probably similar to your listeners. So would you consider at the end of your next episode dropping the trailer for my show? So that allows you, if you have your trailer, you can do that before your actual episode starts running, before your series starts running. And then you will hopefully have a lot of people who are invested in the launch of your show before the launch even happens. Another thing that's great about having a trailer is that you can mark it as a trailer in your hosting provider, which then will show up on podcast listening apps very clearly as a trailer. It'll be clearly defined and clearly delineated as a trailer, and therefore it points potential listeners to it to listen to this hopefully not too long, maybe up to 3-minute short audio piece to get a sense of what your whole show is about, rather than hitting play on an episode that's an hour long and then not getting what they want and then leaving. This gives them a chance to decide in 30 to 60 to 90 seconds, whatever, if this is going to be the show for them. So the real estate is in your favor in that case.
Yeah, and I completely agree about the trailer tag there because otherwise you're like scrolling all the way down to find like episode 0, and it's just like most people aren't going to do that. So if you are able to tag it as a trailer, which I believe now most podcast distribution platforms let you do, and then it just automatically pops it to the top before people scroll down through your episodes. And obviously, if you're trying to check out some older shows that have been around for a long time, this might not be an option. But I do want to say the thing about podcast trailers, too, is that if your show changes over time, you can also just update your trailer.
Absolutely.
There's no rule that says, oh, no, I made one podcast trailer. I can never make another one again for this show. And I think, especially if you are a show that is doing seasons, just do a trailer for every season.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of that. Do a trailer for every season. Also do a trailer for every series. You don't have to go into a studio. You don't have to hire a lot of people to do fancy sound work. You should hire somebody, and that person should be Deanna. But you don't have to do too much in order to give us a teaser of what's to come for this coming series. And it gives you another marketing opportunity. I think people miss out a lot on how important novelty is to a potential listener or to people who are scrolling and deciding what it is they're going to consume that day. When something new pops up, it's a lot easier to market than like, I've got another episode out. I've got another episode out. But if you can say, I'm so excited to, you're tricking them. You're essentially grouping your next 3 episodes into a mini-series, calling that its own mini-series, and then you can brand that. And then that's another marketing opportunity. So I really just think it's all about giving people a reason to stop scrolling and consider something new, even if that thing is not super new.
Exactly. And I'm going to be honest, I am not very good at like writing and creating trailers. When I first started podcasting, and granted, this was back in 2015, it's been almost 10 years now. I had no idea what I was doing. Someone was just like, hey, you want to start a podcast for my website? I was like, sure. We did not have a trailer. I didn't have a trailer for the second and third podcasts that I launched.
I'm sure I didn't either. Please.
It wasn't until my fourth podcast that I even had a podcast trailer. So these are definitely things that, you don't know what you don't know.
We're all evolving.
Yeah. But I think especially now with the number of podcasts that are out there, it's just so overwhelming, and podcast discovery is still so difficult that you're doing yourself a disservice by not having a podcast trailer. And there are so many fun ways to do podcast trailers. Do you have any examples off the top of your head? I know I'm putting you on the spot here a little, of podcast trailers that you just absolutely loved.
Yes. Yes, I do. So you mentioned this before, but I do have a podcast about podcast trailers. And that show is called Trailer Park, the podcast trailer podcast. The premise of it is that each week I feature a different trailer that's been submitted. Anyone can submit their trailer to be considered. I've gotten almost 400 submissions, so it's taken a while to go through those, which is great. I could have content for 5 years easy. And I will. And people submit their trailer, and that means that they're open to receiving criticism publicly about their trailer, but also promotion, So I listen to the trailer, I decide what I like about it, what I don't like about it, what could be improved, what lessons people can take away. And then I play the trailer, and then I analyze the trailer. I share what I liked and what I didn't like. And so in my head, it's both a podcast discovery podcast where you can listen if you want to find another show to listen to, but it's also a great way to learn about making short form audio content if you are a podcaster yourself. And because I've been making this show for either 2 or 3 years, I cannot remember. Post-COVID has confused me so much. I have a lot of favorite podcast trailers, so I'm just now looking at my my list of shows or my list of episodes, and it's so interesting how different people interpret the idea of a trailer. So if you go back in this in my feed here, there's one trailer for the show called Where the Stars Fell with Newt Schottelkotte, and what's really interesting about this trailer is that it's in universe. This is a fiction show, and it's from the perspective of a character in the fiction show. At the end, the character changes the cadence of their voice and says, "Where the stars fell, coming soon." Something like that. And I think that's a really smart way of both giving us a sense of what's within the show and then the practical stuff that we need to know in order to maybe hit play on the show. So I like that one. I like trailers that incorporate musical elements really well. I just actually haven't published this episode yet, but this is a show called Up in Smoke. It's an audio drama, but it kind of seems like it would have really happened, which is my favorite genre of audio dramas. I also loved one called Aftershock that came out a few years ago about like an earthquake that took place off the coast of Los Angeles and, threw everything into disarray, which like could happen. Anyway, and that too, being near Cascadia in Seattle.
I'm also
like
from
that.
Southern California,
so
I completely understand.
Yeah, San Andreas is it's fickle. So anyway, this show, Up in Smoke, is about a fire that happened and one of the children from the house is missing. And like, it is clearly a fiction show in the sense that you can hear the actors. It's very clearly acted. The tape that they have, the quote unquote tape that they have from the quote unquote scene is too good to be true. It's the audio quality is too good for it to have been real tape from a real emergency scene.
Yeah.
However, they do it's honestly such a visual trailer. Like, I think they could have almost used the exact same script if it were visual, but it works audio only as well. And I think this is a really great trailer. So that's Up in Smoke. And I recommend checking that one out. Those are two fiction shows that I've shared. So let me share one nonfiction show. There's a really great trailer for a show called A Field Guide to Gay Animals from Canadaland. Okay. And this is a show that basically just like goes in depth on like, is there gayness in the animal kingdom? And the answer is absolutely. And so it goes into examples of that. And it goes into also like the history of like why science suppressed that for a while, which you could see being obvious because they didn't want humans to be gay. So it's really interesting. Anyway, that's the show, but the trailer is it's such a great snapshot of how funny the actual show is, which is hard to capture. It means that they did a really great job getting the essence of the show and figuring out how the hosts would translate from, 30 to 40 minute episodes into a 30 to 60 second teaser for this show. So I recommend checking that out. There's both tape from individual episodes, as well as narration telling you about the tape and when the show is coming. So for me, it's all a combination of, are you instructing your listeners about when this is coming? Are you giving them an honest sense of what the show is about? And is the audio quality in the trailer on par with the audio quality in the actual show?
That is definitely very important, especially for something like a fiction podcast, which admittedly, fiction podcasts are a pretty big blind spot in my listening. A lot of that is just because by the time I'm done working on podcasts all day, like I don't have the attention span to listen to a fiction podcast where you have to like follow storylines. But when Gimlet first started, for instance, I listened to Homecoming, I watched the adaptation, and it is truly amazing what you can do with fiction podcasts. Yeah. And it's only gotten better since Homecoming, honestly.
That's great.
There are so many great ones out there.
I love that.
Obviously, everyone, a link to the show will be in the show notes, so you can find all of these podcast trailers to go listen to. And hopefully you will find your next favorite podcast.
Yay.
But I want to switch gears to that technical element that I mentioned earlier. And you touched on it a little with the RSS feed. But for anyone who has not started a podcast and might not know this, you can't even submit to Apple until you have one episode in your feed. And I will admit that it has been a lot better lately, but once upon a time when we first started podcasting, sometimes it would take Apple a few days to like submit your show to their directory. So if you're trying to do that with episode 1 and you're like, today's launch day, let's go.
It's not. Today is not launch day.
It's 3 days from now is launch day now, So that is why you want to have a trailer too, because then you have that buffer period. Because like you mentioned, even if you're only doing a 6-episode miniseries, if you prep that trailer 2 weeks before, even if it takes a day, that's not the end of the world. Sure, you want it to be on the schedule that you've picked, but because you have that 2-week lead time, even if you promote the trailer a week out, that's still better than scrambling.
Yeah.
And I've been there as someone who did not do podcast trailers for 3 or 4 different podcasts. It is something that ends up being more stressful than it needs to be. And even though Apple and Spotify are both fairly quick now, I still suggest just launching with a trailer. It populates your RSS feed. You can make sure everything is set up correctly on your back end. I actually ran into this, and it was because it was a problem I didn't know was happening, but I previously had an account with a podcast host. I'm not going to name names because that's not really important, but I had been added to a client's podcast, and I was like, oh, I kind of like this podcast host. I'll try them out for the podcast life. What I didn't realize was that when I added a new show in my account, it was going to tie it to my client's account. And it was like on his billing. And I was just like, oh, okay. So then I had to contact this person that I no longer work with and get confirmation that my show could be moved off of his network. And it was just like a mess. It didn't mess up anything with the feed, but sometimes you just need a little extra time to realize those things. And honestly, it took me over a month to realize that this had happened. Like I was already
you got to build
2-3 episodes in.
Yeah.
So there are just a lot of things on the technical end that even now, like I've been doing this for almost 10 years and I still run into issues that I just like don't expect. So with a trailer, at least you'll be able to like get a feel for your podcast distribution host and you'll be able to submit
like a practice
everywhere.
run.
Yeah. And it's much lower stakes because you're not like, here's our first big episode. It's like, no, here's the trailer 2 weeks ahead of time. So, we have some time to figure things out. But that is really something I always tell my clients too. I'm like, just from the technical end, you just want to like make sure everything's going to work the way you want it. Everything's set up right. And I think that is also, I don't want to say equally as important as the marketing because the marketing is extremely important in this instance, but it's pretty important.
It's crucial. You need both.
Yeah, you really do. Is there anything that we haven't talked about yet that you really want to hit on with the importance of podcast trailers.
Yes. Something that comes up a lot is, somebody's going to listen to this entire episode and say, okay, great. I know I need a trailer, but my show is already 3 years old. And like, how can I make a trailer? And what would that trailer even be about? My show has changed so much over the years. And I would say, yes, you still need a trailer. It's not even, I would say, you do still need a trailer. It's not like the trailer, for all of the benefits and more that we laid out just now, not only does it allow you to distill down your message and act as the top of funnel for a potential listener, and you're taking advantage of the real estate in the podcast listening app and so much more, and all the promotional opportunities, but it also acts as an on-ramp for your listeners and even reminds the listeners who have been there for a while that like you are still making new content and you're still, looking for new listeners. Like that's the reason that this trailer exists. It's not for the people who have been there forever. It's for people who are discovering you. And I think that is reason enough to want to put something together, even if you've been doing it for 10 years.
Yeah. And you can even mention something in that trailer about how much the show has changed over the years, in case anyone does go back and listen from the start. Like I just did that recently. I discovered this podcast, Art of the Cut, which is all about film editing.
Cool.
And it has gone through so many iterations that it has 3 different RSS feeds.
Wow.
And I went back because possibly just because I'm an insane person, but I went back and found all 3 feeds and then pulled out all the episodes that I downloaded, all the episodes I wanted to listen to. And it was like, some of them weren't even under the same name. Like one of them was under this show called Art of the Frame, which is still going, but then Art of the Cut is not on that feed anymore. It was wild. I was like, I don't really understand what happened with this show and why it has 3 different feeds. But I think some of it had to do with it being on a network and then not being on a network, and it's just like kind of starting over with a new feed, even though it's at like episode 200 or something.
God. Ownership changes,
Yeah. It's the same host though. So like there is that consistency at least, but I was very dedicated to finding all of the episodes on movies that I have seen and wanted to listen to. I'm still running through that. So there's still like 20 episodes that I have to get to.
Never-ending content. There's so much.
Yeah. But so in an instance, like, I don't know if they have a trailer, but that is something where I'd be like putting out a trailer to be like, hey, this is the same show as before. Here's why, we have a new feed. Here's where you can find the old episodes.
At that point, it's not even a trailer. It's like a PSA. It's like an email. It's literally just like a notification of what's the latest and why are we doing this. Even if it were like, if I'm a teacher and I podcast during the year, and then I'm taking a break for the summer, maybe I want to put an away message up, basically. Mm-hmm. That is, you can technically mark that as a trailer. That you wouldn't probably market it as a trailer, but it does allow you to use that space. Yeah,
and anyone who comes to the show in that off period, it'll be like, oh, hey, okay, this is why this show doesn't have any episodes right now. Yeah. That is something I have never thought about. Mostly because I have also been a person who, until this podcast,
always on,
was doing weekly shows. And I only took, I think maybe I would take like Thanksgiving week and Christmas week off. Yeah.
Good for you.
The thing about me is sometimes it's just all or nothing.
I feel
that. And it has actually been significantly harder for me to do this show every other week. And then the fact that every other episode is a different format. So I'm doing like interviews, solo episodes, interviews.
Yeah, that keeps you on your toes.
Like, I don't know what day it is. I don't know what week it is. And then like some weeks I'm like, oh, I need to put an episode out tomorrow. It's the on week. It's not the off week.
Yeah. Consistency is something that we hold ourselves to. And it's like, maybe no one else cares, but we do.
I need it because otherwise nothing happens.
It doesn't happen. Yeah.
And, for me, as someone who isn't particularly great at the marketing, like I've been very upfront about that with like anyone who asks me, I'm like, I am very much an editor. Like I can make it sound good. And so even with the trailer for this, I was like, okay, just keep it straight to the point. Tell people like what to expect, that there's going to be interview episodes, solo episodes, explain why and what each of those is planning to accomplish. And if I had thought about this more in advance, maybe this podcast trailer episode would have launched the podcast, but it didn't. And I think that's fine though, because anyone who is looking for help with their podcast, like we said, can do this now if you haven't already done it.
That's right. Love that. Yeah. Take action today.
Yeah. Well, Arielle, I know you have so many things that you are working on. Is there anything else you would like to plug before we go?
My number one mission in life is to get 1 million subscribers for my newsletter, which you can get at earbuds.audio. It's a podcast recommendation newsletter that I love, that I think you will love.
At this point, it was probably about a month and a half ago or so, but I really liked your horror podcast edition of that.
Good. Yeah, we try to create themes that are relevant to, holidays. So a month and a half ago, around Halloween. Great.
Yeah.
Love that.
Yeah. Well, Arielle, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for the opportunity. Love to talk about trailers.